Hello and welcome to Enchantment of Eternity's review for Breaking Bad Season 4. This video is part of a series of videos where I review every episode of Breaking Bad one season at a time. In this video, I will cover all the episodes of Season 4. So, I really feel sorry and I do have to apologize to those watching these videos, especially if you're watching all my reviews of Breaking Bad like one after another. If you're binge watching them, you're going to get really sick of hearing me say this. I do repeat myself all the time, but I do think it is worth noting that I really think that Breaking Bad gets better every season. And I think this is the only show I can think of that it is most true for. In a significant way. I mean, maybe there's some insignificant examples, but really, like, each season ups itself. It really improves itself until the final season, which is really the amazing one. So, Season 2 is better than Season 1, Season 3 is better than Season 2, and Season 4 is better than Season 3. Now, with Season 3, I had my doubts. Is this really better than Season 2? But ultimately, particularly with the ending, I decided that yes, it is better than Season 2. But as far as Season 4 goes, there's no doubt, there's no question that this is the best season the show has done yet. So if it's better than, if Season 3 is better than Season 2 and 1, Season 4 is better than Season 3. So it's easily the best season. Now, it is a unique season though, because when I first started watching it, like I got halfway through, I was like, is this really better than Season 3? I don't know. I don't think it is. I don't think it's as good as Season 3. And we got the last set of episodes, and I'm like, wow, that was way better than Season 3. Now, it is a kind of unique season. It is a lot slower moving than any of the seasons so far. Even Season 3 was pretty slow moving, and Season 2 could be slow moving at times too. But I think this was by far the slowest moving. And I will say, the first half of the season can get a bit dull. It can seem to stretch on a bit too long and lose some interest. And I knew some people who actually, when they were watching Season 4, like, really, I'm not really interested in the show. It seems like the show lost it. Seems like it's not any good anymore. It's just delving into, like, Jesse throwing parties and Walt being all paranoid that Gus is going to kill him, and it's just repeating those beats over again. So I think the show has lost its magic. But then I was like, just hold off. Wait until you finish the season. And of course, once they finish the season, like, oh my God, that was amazing. Now, me personally, this season in particular is what sold the show to me as one of the best shows I've ever seen, as an amazing show. After Season 1, I was like, okay, this is another sort of Weeds type, family man becomes a drug dealer type show, whatever. Season 2, I was like, no, it's a bit better than the Weeds. It's got more into it. You have the character of Gene, you have some dark shit going on, so it's a bit better. And then Season 3 comes along, and it's like, well, actually, no, this is actually quite a good show. That's really intense. But then Season 4 comes along, and you're like, wow, that is one of the best shows ever made. And of course, when Season 5 comes out, it's more like it is the best show ever made. But I'll get to that when I get to Season 5. So Season 4 is constructed, I think, differently than the previous seasons. Because it basically, the first 7 episodes are just there to build. It's just there to set up, and it all slowly builds and builds and builds and builds until you have this amazing ending, absolutely amazing ending. And by ending, I don't mean the last episode, I mean the last 4 episodes were just completely blow your socks off, blow you away. Some of the best, I was going to say television, but no, I'm going to include movies. Some of the best visual storytelling I've ever seen, ever. Particularly as far as, like, sort of anti-hero gangster or drug dealer analysis stories go. Think of, like, Scarface or Goodfellas or some stuff like that. Like, to me, this is by far the best. And I think part of the reason why I would say it's better than some of those classic movies I've never seen The Godfather, never cared to. I'm sorry, so I'm not going to compare it to that. But one of the reasons why I do think it is better than some of these classic movies is because you have all this build-up. I mean, not even to mention like three seasons of build-up, but also if you just look at season 4 in itself, just compare season 4 to some of these movies like Scarface or what have you. Season 4 itself has a lot of build-up setup that even though it's kind of dull and boring and you kind of want them to get on with it while you're watching it, once you get to that payoff is just that much better because that setup is there. Like, so I don't think the setup, and that's why if you notice, I am not calling it filler because it definitely is not filler. Sure, it drags a bit and it probably didn't need to take as long as it did, but it is not filler. Well, I mean, in general, the episodes aren't filler. There are some storylines, some scenes, like Marie going to open houses and shoplifting. That's definitely filler. But in general, like, there's no one episode that's filler. Like, it all sort of contributes to the whole of the story, and in fact the story is that much better because of it. Part of the reason why these 4 episodes are absolutely so amazing, and I would say better than most movies, is because of all that setup you had that really made you understood these characters even more, so when the situation comes to the head and things really get crazy hairy, that it makes it just so much more exciting and interesting. Now, this season in particular, I think is best referred to as the Gus versus Walt season. I think that pretty much lays out exactly what this season was about, which in the end of season 3 kind of set this up. So, season 1 was, Walt finding out he has cancer and dealing with, the prospect of becoming a drug dealer and helping Jesse do it, and sort of describing more of his motivation of, rejecting the money of from Elliot and what's his face, or what's her face, Gretchen and Elliot, and rejecting the money and sort of establishing his pride and why he wants to deal drugs. In the season 2, got sort of more how amateur they are at dealing drugs, and so how many issues they have with the actual distribution side, with dealing with Tuco trying to kill them, and then when they did it themselves, they get into turf wars because Walt doesn't really know what he's doing, and of course also dealing with Walt's relationship with Jesse and how his new love interest Jane kind of intersect and kind of messed that up a bit. And then season 3 explores where they have they've gotten over the distribution problems because they just got in bed with a very smart businessman who knows what he's doing. But again, it deals with the personal issues that Walt has around his cancer and the sort of Jesse's personal issues, and again it gets into their off and on relationship and smooths things out until you find out that the stable business genius they're working for is actually a crime lord who has his own sort of personal things going on with the cartel, which affects Walt's personal life and especially how Hank gets shot and used because of that, and so it starts to affect them more and more until you get to the ending where Walt outright defies Gus, and that leads us to season 4, which is, as I said, pretty plain and simple, Walt versus Gus. And Jesse is kind of he is like the main odd wild card, I should say. He's kind of the key to this fight. And so in between you have, I would say, a struggle between Walt and Gus for control over Jesse. Even though Walt doesn't always realize this, and sometimes he fucks up until towards the end he finally realizes that Jesse is the key, which is a very interesting dynamic. So that is to say that season 4 of Breaking Bad is definitely one of the best seasons of television ever created. Even though I will agree that the first set of episodes, the first half of the season really, was it not the most interesting, but as I said, they set up that ending, which is fucking spectacular. So anyway, let me go ahead and jump into those episodes. Let's start with the first episode, Box Cutter, which actually is a really good episode. I think it's after that the season starts to sort of go on a downhill, sort of slow-paced sloth until they get to the end. But this first episode is really exciting because it picks up right where season 3 left off with Jesse and Walt actually fearing for their lives because they, Mike and what's his face, soon to be dead Goon, tried to kill Walt, but Walt had a play for Jesse to kill Gale, and it actually worked. It succeeded. But here, there's still tension surrounding that, where Walt, especially you can tell that when Gus shows up and Walt is like, "You need me, Gus, you can't kill me." I mean, the way he's talking like that proves that he's not 100% certain that Gus isn't going to kill him. There's definitely a strong amount of doubt that Gus might just say fuck it and kill him anyway, or kill Jesse. And to be fair, I think he could have killed Jesse, because Walt kept saying, if you kill Jesse, I won't work for you. But Gus could just be like, kill Jesse, and be like, okay, if you don't work for me, I'll just kill you. And it's back in the same situation. But again, so that does make me wonder that if even at this stage Gus knew that he could eventually maybe use Jesse against Walt, and that's why he let him live. I don't know. Maybe that's giving Gus too much credit, because it's funny, and I'll get into this more later on, because season 3 ended, the whole conflict between Walt and Gus started because Gus wanted to kill Jesse. And it's funny how Gus will actually ally himself with Jesse later on and still think of Walt as the enemy when this whole thing started, because he wanted Jesse out of the picture and he just wanted Walt to be his ally. So I don't know, part of me was thinking that seems unrealistic, but I don't know, another part of me thinks that no, that actually does make a lot of sense, that Gus would change his focus because Walt would become the bigger irritant, the bigger threat than Jesse, even though this whole thing started because Jesse was the problem. I think things kind of shifted to Walt becoming the problem this season. But I'm getting ahead of myself. So in this episode, it was a really tense episode, basically, because you had the Goon who was trying to convince them that he could just cook without him. And so I think that's part of the reason why Walt was starting to be afraid, especially when the Goon started cooking and he was getting everything right. I do think it was interesting the way Walt was like, oh, I bet he misses the peroxide. He's going to miss it. Watch it. He's going to miss it. Yeah. And then he does it and he's like, oh, fuck. But that's not how Gus sees it. Gus, of course, knows that this Goon could never cook as good as Walt or Jesse. That he would just be repeating the actions that he saw them do. So if anything ever came up, or if there were any other issues or any sort of unforeseen problems or ways of doing it correctly, that he would not be helpful at all. Things would just go to shit, and Gus knew this, that you can't just have someone who just watched other people do it as no actual replacement. And another really interesting thing to note is that the very, very first shot of this episode is a close-up on a box cutter, which I never noticed that before. That's the kind of shit that Breaking Bad, Better Call Saul likes to do. They like to throw in this kind of subtle hints. Of course, the episode is called Box Cutter, and the first scene was just actually a flashback to Gale and Gus, where Gale's sort of opening the lab, which is actually interesting in retrospect, having seen Better Call Saul, because we did see some of the scenes that come before this with Gale and Gus in Better Call Saul, where they're actually conceiving of this super lab, and Gus, of course, is building it with Gale in mind. And the season will explain later on that Gus's whole strategy to break away from the cartel was to find a chemist who was brilliant and can make a better product, and that's why he put out like scholarships or whatever under his legitimate business name for chemists or people coming up in that industry, so he could get a hold of someone early on, and that worked with Gale. And but in this episode itself, Gale was talking about how because it's a flashback apparently to right around the time Gus first met with Walt, and what I get from the context of the scene is that it's when Gus rejected Walt because of Jesse, because he showed up with an addict or whatever. So it was before Gus changed his mind and actually decided to work with Walt, and this scene actually helps explain why Gus changed his mind, because Gale is sort of pushing Gus to be like, look, I'm great, I can do good, but I gotta be honest with you, I can't do that good. This is like way better. Whoever made this is a freaking genius. And I do like that sort of retroactive. Some people might call it retconning, but I know, because obviously this wasn't thought up of in season 2 when these scenes take place. Obviously they just thought up it for this season, but it fits so perfectly. And actually Breaking Bad is, and especially Better Call Saul in particular, is really good at doing that. It's showing things that obviously they hadn't thought up before, that came before the events we've already seen, but they actually fit so well that you don't mind this, and this actually explains better why Gus suddenly changed his mind. And of course it also plays up Gale and how he's this innocent guy who doesn't deserve to be killed outright. And of course a flash to him to present times when he's got a hole in his head, which is actually quite tragic. And of course, Gus kills his own man with the box cutter, which is what the episode's named after, and it's a very sort of famous scene as well. It is a really intense, fucked up scene, because Walt thinks that Gus is going to kill him, because he gets the box cutter out, and Walt is like freaking out, you need me! Because as I said, Walt knows there is a significant chance that Gus is just going to kill him anyway. But he doesn't. He kills the goon instead. And the way he does it, like the look on his face of like pure rage, while he's staring at Walt in particular, while he's killing his own man in front of him, and just tosses the body aside, and the blood just rolls onto Walt where he's sitting, and Gus makes no effort. He doesn't say anything. This is what really establishes Gus as one of the best films ever to grace any screen. And then you have that scene afterwards with Walt and Jesse, where Walt, of course, is all freaked out. He's like, what's our plan? What are we thinking of? And Jesse's kind of resigned to, like, plan. Our plan is to keep working for Gus, otherwise we're going to die, and eventually he will kill us, and there's nothing we can do about it. And it's interesting to see the contrast between that. And of course, part of Jesse's sort of apathy comes from the fact that he just murdered a man, and that's really fucking with his head. An innocent man, actually, who did him no harm, and the season will sort of play off of how much that actually damaged him, which I actually think is part of the brilliant storytelling of the show. But here, Jesse does point out that it probably took Gus years to find Gale, which, as I mentioned earlier, we find out later on is actually true. And it would be really, really hard for him to find another Gale. Therefore, he is stuck with Walt and Jesse, and he has no other option. Because his entire empire, his entire strategy of being independent, breaking away from the cartels, is dependent on having this superior product, which he cannot have without Walt. He has all this money invested, and Walt mentions later on to Skylar that like a company that's so large it could be listed on the NASDAQ is dependent on him, which is the case. So it's kind of like the one flaw in Gus's whole plan. And again, this makes me think of Breaking Bad, because we see the early stages of this plan before you even knew Walt existed. At that point, it was going to be Gale, which of course this beginning scene in this episode does explain the transition from Gale to Walt, which makes so much sense. But anyway, great stuff. So then we get into the next episode, which is 38 Snub. And this is where we get in this is the first episode in a series of like the slug of it's, and I can understand that they maybe overdid this whole thing with Walt freaking out about the fact that, Gus is going to kill him eventually, and he's basically, we hear he is getting paid still and raking in the money. Which is weird because Gus could just simply not paying him anything and use him as slave labor, but we'll see something similar to that happen with Jesse in season 5, but don't want to get ahead of myself. But I guess, Gus wants to maintain appearances or whatever, and he's not like... I mean, I don't want to use... He is cruel, but not in that way. I'll put it that way. That's not his style. So... He continues to pay Walt, but Walt is literally, essentially he's stuck. Like, he's stuck working for a madman that he knows wants to kill him, but can't at the moment, but knows that he's going to try to find any way possible. And as soon as Walt's not useful to him, he'll die. And so that messes with the psyche, which again I think makes a ton of sense. And I actually do like how it's explored. I just think that throughout the season it gets a bit repetitive at some point. Like, as I said, I think there was maybe a little bit too much setup. But in this episode we see, I think this is, if I'm not mistaken, I think this is the first time we meet that arms dealer guy he's a very interesting fellow who's like really smart. We see him dealing with Mike in Better Call Saul, and that's actually brilliant. The two, because they're both sort of intelligent, smart men who see through the bullshit. I do think this is the first time we see him, because in season 3 they had a different arms dealer guy who was a bit of a schmuck. But this guy is like really smart. And in fact, he almost he's so wise he almost talks himself out of a deal, because he's like, why are you buying a gun illegally? Why don't you just go to a gun show? But anyway, that was a cool scene. I like that guy. And then Walt tries to kill Gus, of course, but he never gets to see him. And Gus, and then I love how Mike can tell right away that he has that gun, even though Walt specifically bought it so it could be hidden. And it's like, oh, if you want stealth, that's the whole reason he bought it, and Mike still spotted it, which I love. And I love Mike's attitude about it, too. He's like, well, you can wear the gun if it makes you feel better, but it's actually not going to make any difference. God. And this season really establishes Mike. And I got to say, the season overall, it feels like this is the season that Better Call Saul is building up to and setting up. I mean, a little bit the first 3 seasons, but not as much as this season in particular. This seems to be the whole thing, as far as the prequel goes, that Better Call Saul, particularly the Mike and Gus storylines of that show. Not so much the Saul storyline, but yeah, it's pretty much building up to this season. But anyway, and this is when you get Jesse's first starting his never-ending party. Of course, he gets back into the drugs because it's his own way of coping with having to murder someone, and he gets his friends over to have this party that he never wants to end. And then even it gets too much for Skinny Pete and Badger. Eventually, they even leave. But so he ends up just having all these strange, weird people who are not the right crowd to roll with. Just live at his house and party nonstop. And it's part of it is, I've heard some people describe that it's part of it was just his trying to numb himself after murdering Gail, which I definitely think is a huge factor, probably the biggest factor, but not the only one. I think the other factor is his knowledge that he's a walking dead man, that he's going to die soon, that Gus is going to kill him eventually, and so why not just say fuck it? I mean, what's the point of doing anything, because you're going to die soon anyway? And I definitely think that's a huge factor in this never-ending party thing. So it was, a decent, okay episode, whatever, but as I said, this is kind of where it starts to get slow. But then we get into the next episode, which is Open House, which again, this is it starts repeating some of the same bits, so it's a bit less interesting of an episode. This sort of, it deals more with I'm getting some of the episodes blended in my head, and sometimes I forget what happens in which. So you'll forgive me if I get some events in one episode and mistaken from a different episode, because especially these set of episodes tend to blend together because it's pretty much just reinforcing the same thing. It touches more on like Skylar trying to buy the car wash. I love the eyebrows that kill or whatever. I think this, if I'm not too mistaken, I do think this is the episode where she first approaches him and he rejects her. And then, of course, the main thing this title suggests that this is the episode that deals with Marie. This is whole storyline, I guess it started in the previous season where Hank is still dealing with his disability after getting shot in previous seasons, and he's becoming like really nasty to Marie, which is, something that is commonplace where people deal with their own sort of tragedy they get on in their own head, and he's really treating her like shit. Even when the physical therapist is trying to help him, like he's like really cool with him, but as soon as Marie tries to get in there, he's just like, oh, whatever, Marie, fuck off. And Marie, her way of coping with this emotionally is to go out to these open houses and just steal shit. Which, it makes sense character-wise. I just don't particularly care. As I said, that when they did this in season 2, like, I think maybe, was it season 1 or was season 2? I don't know. Whenever it was, I thought, I don't care about this. I really don't. And then Hank is getting obsessed with his minerals or whatever, and it just wasn't that interesting. Whatever. So, yeah, gotta say I wasn't as impressed with this episode. So then the next episode is Bullet Points. Now, if I'm not too mistaken, this is the episode when Jesse is like really careless with his money, and one of his, just random no good people sees him with a wad of cash. Like, he sees him go upstairs into his room and then come back with a wad of cash. So he's like, well, the wad of cash has got to be in his room. So he steals the money. And what's interesting about this is that Jesse doesn't care. He doesn't even give a shit. And it's Mike and random goon number 2 that actually catch him and give the money back to Jesse. And he's like, yeah, sure, whatever. I love how Jesse calls Mike out on it, because Mike is like, do you want to know what we're going to do with him? And Jesse's like, no, not really. He's like, are you sure? He's like, oh, let me guess, you're going to kill him? No, you're not going to kill him, because if you're going to kill him, you wouldn't have him blindfolded. You just want me to be like, oh, I'm going to change my ways. He's like, nah, fuck that, and just walks off. I actually love that scene, to be honest. I think it shows, like, Jesse's sort of apathy, and that exactly, and how he called Mike out, because Mike is a genius. He usually is 2 steps ahead, but Jesse saw right through it, which I thought was cool. Although, in contrast, later on Mike's other sort of power player mind game with Jesse, he doesn't see through it. Jesse does let himself, but in this case, he did see through it. So I guess Mike had to come up with something even better, with Gus's help, apparently. But that whole thing was interesting. And speaking of Mike, we had the opening scene where he was in a truck where they're transporting the drugs for Gus, and it got raided by the cartel. So it starts to establish that the cartels are sort of striking back against Gus, because and it's interesting again because it makes me have a different perspective on all the setup we have within Better Call Saul, where they're setting up for Gus, sort of trying to build up to the severing ties from the cartel. And we saw in the previous season that when they had the cousins kill or try to kill Hank, but he warned Hank, it was all a huge power play to sever himself from the cartel, because he used that as an excuse for the DEA interference, which made it harder for the cartel to operate north of the border, and also had the federales raid the house of Juan Bosa and kill him, and so that really weakened and damaged the cartel. But as we see now, even though he did sever his ties from the cartel still exists. And after the heat, died down a bit, they were able to come back and sort of unkindly remind Gus that they want in on the action, that he can't operate without him, that they're not going to allow it, so they just randomly raid his trucks. And we see here in this episode that Mike is able to stop them. He gets shot in the ear, but he's able to hide in the truck and stop them from doing it. But we see in the later episode they have some random guys in the truck, and if it's random guys and not Mike, well, they're just going to die and not succeed. But in this case, Mike did succeed, but they know that they have a problem with the cartel. And again, this also deals with, Skylar buying the car wash. I think this is the episode where she actually, manipulates. I think this is the first time we see Bill Burr as playing one of Saul Goodman's associates. To be honest, this is the first time I've ever heard of Bill Burr was because of this show. In fact, when I later saw him as a comedian, I'm like, hey, it's a guy from Breaking Bad. But anyway, and Skylar does plays that. I'm not sure if it's this episode or not. Sometimes I get my episodes mixed up. Where he has Bill Burr show up and pretend to be like, oh, you have all these septic problems. It's going to cost you tons and tons of money. Might be the next episode, actually, but whatever. That was kind of cool. Anyway, speaking of the next episode, let's get into it. It's called Shotgun. Now, when I did my bottom 5 worst episodes of Breaking Bad, this was one of them. Watching it now, it's not a terrible episode. It's just boring. There's just not much to it. It's probably more filler, or they're just taking way too long with the setup. Like, there's no reason for it to be this slow. And it's mostly boring, to be honest. I mean, again, it gets into the con. They're playing with Jesse, where Mike is having Jesse just randomly say, come with me, and gave him no explanation, and slowly they're just going out and doing these drops with doing random shit that's actually kind of boring. And honestly, it's boring for the viewer as well. But it ends with them doing like this whole setup with where they get these people to rob Mike, and Jesse manages to save the day, and it's quite obvious that was all just a setup to ingratiate Jesse greater, to make him feel better about himself and boost his confidence and help push him towards Mike and Gus and sort of manipulate him in that way. As I said, this is sort of their new play to sort of control Jesse in order to control Walt, because they realize Walt is too strong-willed and independent, and there's nothing they can do about it. Oh yeah, by the way, I know this happened like 2 episodes or 3 episodes ago. I think it was 38 Snub this happened with, but I just remember I forgot to mention the scene where Walt approaches Mike at the bar and says, just get me in a room with Gus, and Mike responds, I punch him in the face. That was fucking awesome. But anyway, yeah, that was back in 38 Snub. As far as this episode goes, yeah, I realized, like, after watching this episode, because I do think if I did a top 5 worst list of Breaking Bad again, this probably would still make my list. But that's mainly because there's not many bad episodes of Breaking Bad. It's actually, there's not. It's more like slow-paced, kind of boring, mediocre episodes. But even those episodes sort of contribute to the story overall. So they're not really bad episodes. I think in actuality, there's only one true bad episode of Breaking Bad, which I talked about in season 3. So I was planning on doing like a top 10 worst episodes of Breaking Bad video at the end of this, because I usually do that when I cover these shows like one season at a time. It's usually a tradition where I'll do a top best episode list and a worst episode list. But I changed my mind. I'm actually not going to do one for Breaking Bad, because it wouldn't be worst episodes. It would be one worst episode, and the rest would just be mediocre episodes that maybe weren't that interesting. And so it would be like the mediocre list, and I don't think that's worth it. I think this is too good of a show. Like, it honestly doesn't have that many bad episodes. It actually speaks very highly of the show that this episode is one of the worst, because it's not actually that bad. It's just kind of slow, kind of boring, but you still have interesting setup in it, and it still contributes to the whole of the story. So, yeah, I don't think I'll bother with the best list, or worst list, sorry. Definitely still going to do a best list. Anyway, we'll get into the next episode, which is Cornered. God, hold on a second. I can't even remember what happens in this episode. Give me a second. Yeah, honestly, I looked the episode up, and honestly, I can see why I kind of forgot about what happens in it, because it is another sort of generic key in the chain. Again, not a bad, terrible episode, but just another sort of building episode where not much really happens. So, although the most significant part of this episode is this is the episode where Walt gives his infamous "I am the one who knocks" speech, which actually, when I first watched this episode, I didn't think much of it. It wasn't until later where I heard everyone quoting it and making such a big deal out of it. Because honestly, I think I guess this is setting up the character he will become in season 5, because I think it's sort of more appropriate there. But it's setting up how he wants to see him, like how he sees himself and how he wants to be. But in actuality, it's not how he is in this episode, because how he is in this season is kind of just a slave to Gus. But he wants to see himself as this huge badass who has all this power, which they also explored in another scene in a later episode coming up, where he's going to a appointment to check up on his cancer and make sure it's still in remission. When this other guy's like, "Oh, you have to surrender yourself to your cancer and realize that you're powerless," and he's like, "That's so much bullshit. I have power. I'm in control." So it does get into his mindset, is that is what keeps Walt going, is this sort of vision he has himself of being this powerful man who's in control of his destiny. And so when Skylar starts freaking out about, "Oh my God, we're in so much danger and we're gonna die," Walt's reaction is like, "I am not in danger, I am the danger." Which, to an extent, because he says he's the one who knocks, because they're particularly talking about Gale, because Skylar's thinking, that Walt could become another Gale, but Walt knows that Gale was killed by him, not by Gus. I mean by Jesse, but he sent Jesse to do it. So he, in that case, was the one who knocks, or Jesse was the one who knocks. But anyway, he was the danger, or whatever. But, he actually is in danger. He's just in huge denial about it, and has this a delusion of being in control. Now, it was the previous episode, and again, I forgot to mention this, but there was a scene where, Hank is starting to think that Gale was Heisenberg, because another cop brings him the information about Gale's case, and Hank gets interested, but he thinks, that Heisenberg's dead now because it was Gale. And Walt is the one who sort of changes Hank's mind and gets him to think, maybe Heisenberg's is still out there, and that leads to this whole investigation. So there's an investigation that happens later in the season, which will factor greatly, and mainly factor into why Gus wants to kill Walt even more, is that Hank keeps interfering and investigating Gus, and I think in this episode it's actually when Hank goes to Steve Gomez and his boss, saying that his theory that Gus is the super meth dealer or whatever, this drug lord. And it's all Walt's fault, because Walt, in that dinner scene in the previous episode, let his pride get in the way, because Hank was talking about how much of a genius Gale was. And so Walt has, if you want my opinion, he was just an idiot. He was just a lackey. The true genius is still out there, because it's his damn ego. And again, this is all about his pride and his ego, and he often lets it really fuck things up for him. But anyway, back to this episode in particular. Again, not much interesting happened to it. It's sort of dealt more with them keeping Jesse away from Mike, and here Jesse makes himself useful by dealing with these meth heads who stole the drugs or whatever that the cartel just simply gave to them after killing people in the truck. And Jesse sort of knows how meth heads think and is able to just trick them. It is an interesting scene there when he just starts randomly digging a hole for no reason. And the meth head's like, oh, why are you digging a hole? He gets him to dig the hole for him. It's pretty funny. Pretty interesting scene. Again, they're not bad episodes. Like, it's not a bad episode. It's still somewhat interesting. It's just really, really slow moving. But more importantly, this is the episode where Walt comes up with a plan for Jesse to kill Gus. And it's funny that Walt is kind of building up to it. And Jesse can tell, is again saying how smart he is when he says to Walt, like, would you stop with the sales pitch already? Fine, I'll do it. I'll kill him. Because at this stage, Jesse is like, he still thinks that Gus is going to kill him, and that's probably wise of him to think that, but he also kind of halfway blames Gus for him having to murder Gale, for putting him in that situation. So he's like, yeah, fine, he's still on board with it, and they come up with the plan to use the ricin and put it in the cigarette and whatnot. And this is also the episode where Walt buys the really flash car for Walt Jr., which is interesting because usually Walt is the smart one who knows that, like, if someone went out and spent their money, like, really willy-nilly, he would be like, what are you doing? He'd be freaking out. But in this situation, like, he lets pride get in the way. He's like, well, I'm making all this money. I'm, like, wasting my life away and put my life in danger to make all this money. Why can't I spend it to buy my son something nice on his birthday? But, Skylar comes by and says that's ridiculous. It doesn't look right, even though he does have all that money. Legally, he can't. So could bring a lot of trouble down the line. She's the voice of reason. She also points out how Walt Jr. is going to be pissed off at her and blame her for taking the car back. And so he starts to realize that he did, in fact, make a mistake. But this is after his I am the one who knocks speech, which, of course, scared the fuck out of Skylar. That was also very interesting. But anyway, we'll move over to the next episode, which is called Problem Dog. I like the scene that this episode is made for because it does make a lot of sense. And again, it deals with Jesse's issues over having killed Gale, and we see him visit that one dude who was in Dear John, who was playing like the counselor, the drug counseling, goes to his sort of meetings, which we hadn't seen him go to since season 3. And in fact, when he sees Jesse, it's like, oh, I haven't seen you in a while. Thanks for coming back, and how are you doing? And he tries to relate what's on his mind, and what's on his mind is him killing Gale. But of course, he can't outright and say he killed another person because nothing can stop them from calling the police on him. So he frames it in that he killed the dog, and then this other lady freaks out about him doing animal cruelty. And his reaction here is really interesting, because of course at first the counselor guy tries to defend Jesse, and Jesse's like, no, maybe she's right, maybe I could have done differently. Like, he says that he's put an ad in the paper or whatever, but for him, it's the analogy. He knows what's essentially saying. Maybe there is something else he could have done differently that wouldn't result in him killing Gale, which honestly, there wasn't. That was really the only way about the situation, but he would have his second thoughts. That makes sense. And then eventually, when the counselor still tries to console him, eventually he admits to bringing people there to try to sell meth, and his whole purpose to coming in the meetings in the first place was to sell people meth, which isn't true, because actually when he first started going to the meetings, it was sincere, but then of course he later changed it. And he basically says, I made you my bitch. Are you okay with that? And he's like, no, I'm not. He simply says no. And it was a really chilling reaction. And Jesse's like, thank God, like, it's about time you finally stood up for yourself. So that was actually a really powerful scene. I do really like that. Now, this is also the episode where Walt, Skyler, of course, tells Walt to take the car back, the Flash car back, and I don't know, it kind of gets in his mindset about how he's just so frustrated and just sick of dealing with shit. And he takes the car out to the lot, does all these wheelies, and then just blows it up just to see it explode. And like how the way Saul sort of deals with him afterwards, and like, I hope that blew off some steam because that's going to cost you tons of money. And Saul had to do his best to keep him out of jail from doing that. Yeah, so that was pretty interesting. But then, of course, Hank sort of ups his investigation on Gus, and then he actually starts having Walt drive him around to kind of to investigate Gus. And I love that when Walt goes inside of Los Polios Hermanos, that Gus is actually there, because usually Gus dodges Walt, but Walt is like afraid. He was fearing for his life, and he's like, I didn't do it. And Gus is like, do it. That was pretty good. But again, so somewhat better than the previous episodes, because you do have a lot of interesting points here, but again, it's sort of continuing into a whole. So the next episode, this is where I think the season finally starts to pick up, episode 8. So it's 13 episodes in the season. See, the first episode was good, was great, box cutter, but then you got 6 episodes, so it's basically half the season. 6 to 13, so it's either 6 or 7, whatever. So this is when you get into the second half of the season. And this episode deals more with Gus's backstory. And again, this is something Better Call Saul will explore even more. But here, like, this one flashback we get at the end of this episode is actually chilling. It really explains a lot of Gus's history with the cartel. How he has a partner who they have trying to propose to the cartel to go into business together to sell meth, and their pitch doesn't work because they decide, and Hector, in his heyday, just randomly comes up to Gus's partner and kills him. Now, there's a lot of innuendo, and I think people involved with the show even suggested that this definitely was the case, that the man that they killed, Gus's partner, and this was his lover. And watching this scene again, I actually really do get that vibe. At first I was kind of resistant to that, just not because, gay people icky, like, they want to be gay, that's fine, I don't care, but I often have problems with where two men have a strong platonic relationship, and often, like, audience will jump to, they're gay, because can't men have strong feelings for each other without being gay? Can heterosexual women do it all the time, and heterosexual men, that's too gay, you can't be too friendly with other men? Like, good examples of this is like Sam and Frodo from Lord of the Rings, or you got O'Brien and Bashir from Deep Space Nine for you Star Trek fans. And that annoys me. So at first, when I first heard that there, my first thought was to reject it along those same lines, but watching this episode again, I think actually, no, that is clearly implied, that they're lovers, and that's actually fine. That's I don't have an issue with that. In fact, it actually does explain a lot of sort of Gus's hatred towards the cartel, if they in fact killed the person he loved the most, who he's still holding a candle for. What a fucking brutal scene that was too. It was just, a fucking brutal scene, and it really explained sort of the whole backstory and his hatred of Hector. And this is, I don't know if it was this episode or a previous one, it might have been a previous one, where they're establishing where Gus visits Hector in a nursing home, and they have this sort of hate relationship where like Gus can, because it's funny, they had Hector and interact with Gus in season 3, but then it was sort of, he definitely had animosity towards Gus, but it wasn't as strong as it is now. I think if I recall in season 3, did Gus like take credit for killing Tuco's cousins? I think he did. So maybe that's why they have more of an antagonistic, straight out adversarial. And again, Better Call Saul explored the sort of backstory on how Hector ended up in the wheelchair in the first place was actually Gus's doing. Well, kind of, sort of. But anyway, digress. I mean, it wasn't Gus's doing directly, but someone tried to kill Hector, but Gus actually saved Hector's life, but made it so once he was paralyzed in a chair, Gus stopped trying to help him because he wanted him to be in this living hell. But anyway, enough talking about Better Call Saul. So it was actually very interesting, and actually this is the first episode of the season where it is sort of Gus centric. We do sort of see more from his perspective, and how he's sort of manipulating Jesse and dealing with Hank, and whatever. So ultimately, I think this was a pretty great episode. So then we get into the next episode, which is Bug, which again, we're getting into the more higher quality episodes. I think this is another really good episode. The bug, referring to the bug that Hank placed on Gus's car, which apparently Gus knew about, so it turned up nothing. It was so uneventful that Hank kind of got the feeling that he was being toyed with. But also Walt bugs Jesse's car later, and I'll get to that a bit later. But also the situation with the cartel sort of comes to a head where they just, Gus has to move his operation because Hank is snooping around. But while he's doing that, the cartel randomly show up and just start killing people, and Jesse almost gets killed himself. Now, I forgot that I think this is actually in the previous episode, Hermanos, which actually makes it really good, that where Gus meets with a member of a cartel and he tries to come up with all this fancy negotiation. The cartel member is just none of that matters. Yes or no, answer the question. Yes or no means, is he going to let the cartel take half his profits? And that's all there's nothing else. There's no negotiating. In fact, the guy even flat out says this isn't negotiation. There's no negotiating. It's just yes or no. And obviously Gus says no. And so they come back and show up and just start randomly killing his people. And Gus does this whole Terminator act where because he knows that they won't kill him, so he just runs up right out to the gunman and starts shouting at him. And they shoot around Gus, but Gus knows full well that they're not going to, and he shows no fear in that because he knows they're not going to kill him because they need him to make all this money, because if they kill him, then all that, those millions of billions of dollars they can make just goes away. But of course, at the moment, they're not making anything off of him, so, but they want to, so they can kill his people, but not him. And they can sort of weaken his production, but they don't want to get rid of it entirely because they want to take it over. So that was pretty damn intense. And I do believe, so then Gus invites Jesse over for dinner, and you see Jesse's eyeing the food, and he's eyeing the rice, and as he'll explain later, everything's in one big pot, so he couldn't exactly poison Gus without poisoning himself. So he doesn't go through with it. And Gus sort of, lays out this plan to go to Mexico to meet with the cartel to try to finally capitulate to them. And part of that is having Jesse show them how to make the blue meth, because he doesn't trust Walt enough to do it. So that was pretty intense. But then you get Walt, who, out of paranoia, he has to said put the tracking device on Jesse's car and saw that Jesse did in fact meet with Gus, and Yeah, so a lot of shit this whole time, a lot of shit's going down with Walt, where Hank keeps pushing this investigation with Gus, and Walt tries to interfere, but it's not working. In fact, I believe this is the episode where Walt purposely crashes the car with Hank in it, rather than go to the laundromat. So Walt is dealing with his own shit while he knows his life is in like high risk at the moment because of Hank's activities, and so he's freaked out that in his mind, Gus needs to die right away, otherwise he's fucked. So that's part of the reason, and he's waiting on Jesse. Like Jesse was supposed to do it long, and get around to it. So Walt starts to doubt him, and that's why he puts the bug in his car. And when he finds out that Jesse was at Gus's house for over 2 hours, and Jesse calls him over, and Jesse goes on this whole spiel about how he's going to Mexico and he needs help. Can you help me, tutor me, give me, pointers or whatever? And Walt just completely ignores it and asks him if he saw Gus, and Jesse at first denies it, but then Walt reveals that he knows for a fact he met with Gus for 2 hours, and Jesse points out that that they were eating all the same food, but Walt is he's desperate, so he's being a bit unreasonable, where he's like begging Jesse. He's like, look, you have to do it, and saying it, starting to doubt Jesse and think that he doesn't want to do it, that he's brought out by Gus, which I don't think it's true. I mean, maybe to a small extent, but I do think, because we saw in that scene that Jesse was eyeing his cigarette, he was eyeing the food, so he did really want to do it, but I think he generally was scared that if he tried to poison Gus, he would poison himself as well, which I think is a legitimate fear. I mean, surely, maybe Gus wound up going up to the bathroom, maybe he could sprinkle it into his wine or his food or some shit then, but I don't know. I think it was more of Jesse was scared of getting caught by Gus, which is a legitimate fear to have, to be fair. But Walt doesn't see it that way. Walt thinks that Jesse just doesn't want to do it anymore. and so, Walt's response is when Jesse asks for help and I've done all these things for you, can't you help me now? And Walt's response is, you've done all these things for me? No, what you have done is killed me. You've essentially... So Walt, this is again his classic, he loses his temper too much, and at this point his panic has really accumulated to the point, as I said, he thinks his only way out is to kill Gus. And the fact that Jesse, in his opinion, doesn't want to do it anymore, freaks him out and says, you've essentially killed me. And so he loses his shit and says to Jesse, I hope you end up in the barrel and die in the barrel in the middle of the desert in Mexico. And of course Jesse's dealing with his own shit and freaked out and throws the bug at Walt's head and punches, and they get into a huge fight. And that's the main reason why I love this episode though so much, because that fight was fucking amazing. And honestly, me personally, I don't know if other people watching this episode felt differently, but me personally, I was totally on Jesse's side. I think Walt was being an asshole, prideful and arrogant, and especially the way Walt was he's so preoccupied with killing Gus, instead of really, and that's part of the issues, that he really should have calmed down, thought about this logically, but instead he just thought that Jesse wasn't going to do it at all, so he'd given up hope. He was just like, you killed me, Bob, fuck you, and just lost his shit, which is not the right reaction. That's why Walt isn't as big of a genius as some people give him credit for. And later on, he will come to realize that this, in fact, was the dumbest thing he could have possibly done, because one of the only things keeping him alive is Jesse, and the fact that he just alienated Jesse to the point where, at the end of the fight, Jesse, says to Walt, can you walk? And he says, yeah, and he's like, okay, get the fuck out of here and never come back. And I'm like, no, you have gone and fucked up, Walt. That was the biggest mistake he possibly could have made. But that whole scene was fucking amazing, beautiful. So now we get into the last 4 episodes of the season, and each one of these episodes is a pure masterpiece. First, we'll get into one of my favorite episodes of the entire show, and it's one of my favorite pieces of fiction in anything ever. Salute. And again, I love the clever titles. Oh, God. So first, let me talk about the Walt stuff, because I think a lot of people forget about the Walt stuff in this episode, including myself, which actually was really good stuff. I think is actually the best use of Walter Jr. ever, where Walter Jr. Gets a legitimate car for his birthday, and he goes over and sees Walt, and Walt doesn't want to be seen. He's hiding, and Walt's like, and Walt Jr. is like, look, I'm going to call the police. I'm so worried about you. So Walt has to let him in, so he won't do that. And Walt, of course, is like beat up and looks like shit because Jesse beat the shit out of him. And he has that moment where he breaks down and cries because he realizes now that he only made things worse by alienating Jesse like that, and also the fact that he does think of Jesse as another son. And so when he goes to his actual son and wants sort of the love of a son, but because he realizes that he fucked up his other sort of fatherly relationship. And of course he's crying and freaking out because he realizes that actually put him in greater danger by doing that, and realizes that it was such a huge mistake, and it was a raw reaction. And I love how the next day when Walt Jr. sleeps over and Walt is just like, I don't want you to remember me like that. That's not who I am. I'm actually a much stronger person. But Walt Jr.'s reaction is, and again, because that's Walt's pride, and in fact he tells a story about his father had dementia and how he remembers him as sort of a monster and creep, and he doesn't want Walt Jr. to remember him that way, but Walt Jr. is just like, no, that wouldn't be the worst thing ever to remember you that way, because that was real. That felt like real, raw emotion. Like a bad way to remember you would be like the way you've been behaving all year, all arrogant and whatnot. And I love that because that was a nice sort of wake-up call to Walt and his sort of prideful attitude. So yeah, those scenes were great. They were some of the best. I think it's the best use they've ever had of Walt Jr. And one of the best. This is season 5 to come. But damn, like that was such a powerful scene of them connecting. But now let me get into the sort of heart of the episode that makes it so great is, of course, Gus and Jesse and Mike going to Mexico to meet with the cartel. And the scenes where Jesse's teaching the cook, like, that's a pretty good, I love it because it shows like Jesse sort of, he felt out of his element, he felt unconfident, he felt like he didn't know what he's doing. But he shoved that all aside and decided to respond to the cartel chemist very arrogantly, like he knew what he was doing, because basically he points out, like, your boss brought me here to show you how it's done, so go clean this shit up. We're not cooking anything until this is clean. Like, that was absolutely, and I love how when they're all speaking Spanish at first and Jesse is like, does this asshole know what he's doing? And the guy thinks he's being all clever, but like, I speak English. But Jesse doesn't miss a beat, gets right up in his face, and he's like, oh, so you know what the word asshole means? Asshole. Like, I love that. Oh my God, that was such a great scene. But again, pussyfooting around what makes this episode such a fucking masterpiece. And that, of course, is the slaughter of Don Hilario and all the cartel members of Gus finally getting his revenge. And it is sort of really telling that it happens at the same pool that we saw where they killed Gus's partner, most likely lover. And god damn, the scene is just so fucking good. And I love how, like, we the audience don't know that he just poisoned everyone. And that kind of puts us in Don Hilario's perspective at this moment, because Don Hilario kind of suspects Gus at first, but Gus drinks. But then, of course, we have more information than Don Hilario does, because we saw Gus taking these pills shortly before he gave him that gift. And so he's obviously prepared, and he's like, "Oh, can I go to the bathroom?" So he goes to the bathroom. He neatly puts the towel down on the floor so he can kneel in it, and proceeds to make himself throw up. So this, and again, I can't remember what my reaction was when I first watched this episode because it was so long ago. But that should have been the first clue that something was up. And then shortly thereafter, though, you see everyone start to convulse and die. And, Gus is, not Gus, but Don Ilario's goon, you see, starts to realize something's up, but while he's freaking out, Mike sneaks behind him and strangles him to death. And just the scene of, like, that goon being strangled to death by Mike while everyone else is, like, dying of poison. And then, God, it's just the whole way the scene was shot was just beautiful. I mean, this is the creators of Breaking Bad and Better Call Saul, like, have a signature cinematography and the way of blending style of music and whatnot. And so a lot of times they do that for us scenes that are kind of insignificant, and they kind of just be like, "Ooh, look at how artsy we are." Like the whole plane crash in season 2 and the whole ants climbing over ice cream thing they did in Better Call Saul, which I thought was really pretentious. But sometimes when they do it correctly in scenes that are already so fucking powerful, and I think this is the best example of when we see Gus walking out of the bathroom and they have that party music playing in the background, and it gets louder, and the camera sort of does a follow of Gus as he walks, does a slow walk outside to see everyone choking and dying. Like, it's cinematography at its best. It's film, television, whatever you want to call it, visual medium at its absolute best. Like, this tops most movies, even really good ones, ever made, ever. Like, this is just like, it's the pinnacle of visual storytelling. It does not get any better than this. And that was just, god damn it, that was just so intense. It was so amazing. It's, I can't, however many other good words that you can think of I can throw out of this. It's just a masterpiece. It is a masterpiece. And then we see, of course, even though Gus did take precautions, like he took those pills and he threw up, it didn't protect him entirely from the poison. He's still at risk, and we see him collapse, and Mike and Jesse have to, and he just gives us, of course, chilling speech of, like, Don Ilario is dead, all of his followers are dead, so you can give up and leave in peace, or you can face us and die. Like, oh God. And of course, he's partly bluffing because he's, like, dying of poison, and Mike and Jesse are his only men, and Jesse's not, like, an expert killer or anything like that. Mike is, but just Mike. So, they take Jesse out, they take Gus out to a car, and Mike gets shot in the process, which is really important, and Jesse steps up and kills the guy who's shooting at Mike. And this is kind of sort of a redemption moment for Jesse, because again, he feels, and Jesse, I'll get more into his character at some point, but he's not a killer. Like, and it's part of the issue he had with the all season with the guilt he was feeling over killing Gale. So although he saves the day, it's still, he's not okay with killing people at all, even if they're shooting directly at him. But he manages, to get Gus and Mike out of there. And I think, so, fuck. I mean, this is just a masterpiece of an episode. It's just so fucking good. Then we get to the next masterpiece, which is called Crawl Space. It starts off with dealing with the aftermath of the shooting, where Jesse takes them to a doctor in Mexico, which we will see again in Better Call Saul, because here they establish that Gus and him really have a huge relationship, and that they have a huge background, and the doctor, like, loves Gus as a brother. This time definitely not romantic, but definitely they have a kinship there. But I love how when Jesse, like, opens the door for them to help Mike, because Mike is the one who's in greater danger of dying because he was shot. But they just completely ignore Mike and just grab Gus and take him in. Jesse has to carry Mike in himself. And he's like, can you help them? This man needs your help. And the doctor's just like, well, this man pays all my bills. And it's funny because later they reveal that they had pre-planned this. Like, they had blood ready for all three of them, for Mike and for Jesse, and it was labeled. So they were prepared to help Mike. So I think that scene was maybe a bit ridiculous, a bit overboard that they weren't going to help him at all, because that doesn't seem to jive with the fact that they were prepared to help him anyway. But obviously their priority was going to be Gus, but I think they kind of exaggerated that a bit too much. But whatever. Anyway, so Gus and Jesse make their way back to the States, but the thrust of this episode is that things come to head for Walt. Now, one thing that Gus has learned, which he points out, is that Jesse can cook on his own and doesn't need Walt anymore, but Jesse is still really insistent that Gus not kill Walt. And that he's like, can't you just fire him or whatever? So that's what Gus does. He grabs Walt, puts a hood over his head, takes him out in the middle of the desert, and says, "You are fired. Never come back, never do anything, and I'm gonna deal with Hank however I want. If you interfere with me, I will kill your wife, I will kill your son, I will kill your infant daughter." Like, the way he says that was like, fuck. And this is where we see Walt is at his absolute worst. Like, this is where his worst nightmare was just realized. Even though he knows that he's like, and he even like brags to Gus at one point. It's like, oh, Jesse won't let you kill me, because if he would, I would be dead already. He's bragging about it, but Gus is like, he'll come around eventually. And especially Walt having that knowledge that he just alienated Jesse by beating the crap out of it, by getting that fight. He got the crap beat out of him, but either way, he realized that Jesse's loyalty is the one thin little thread that's keeping him alive, and it could snap at any moment. So he realized just how fucked he is, especially the way Gus is like, "I will kill your infant daughter." It's like, fuck. Of course, he freaks the hell out and is all about getting so earlier Saul had introduced the concept of using the disappearer. I love this is the first mention. It wasn't in this episode, it was previous episode, but this season it's the first mention of the disappearer, who will become sort of an important factor later on. Not just later on, but in Breaking Bad, but also in Better Call Saul and the El Camino movie. But anyway, so Walt goes to Saul and is like, okay, we need this disappearer, and Saul's like, okay, it's going to cost you a shit ton of money. Specifically, it's like $125,000 for the whole family. And he's like, okay, so he rushes home to get the money. Now, let me get into this side plot, which I hadn't really touched on. Actually, I think they did a little bit in the previous episode, too, I think this side plot's okay. Like, I don't think it's the best thing ever, but it's not bad. It's not terrible. Like, it certainly doesn't interfere with how awesome these episodes are. But it's a bit silly about the whole side plot with Ted being investigated by the IRS, and of course Skyler worked for him, so if the IRS investigates him, they'll investigate her, and if they investigate her, they'll find the car wash, and they'll find leads back to Walt, and they would all get fucking arrested, and it would ruin their entire lives. So Skyler rightfully freaks out and tries to get Ted to pay out to. First of all, she shows up and puts on this act. Again, this is the previous episode, but whatever. For the IRS in order to get him out of the trouble, but he needs to pay them off in order to keep them off and back, but he's refusing to do it. First of all, he says, I don't have the money. So she comes up with this con, and Saul thinks it's a bad idea the whole time. He gets, to pretend his great aunt that he never knew died and left him all this money, but like the fucking idiot he is, he just goes out, starts spending the money on random shit and trying to get his business back, and Skyler's like, look, you need to pay the IRS, and he outright refuses. And so in this episode, I think this episode is the one where we do see Skyler go to him, and he outright refuses, or maybe it was the previous, I don't remember. But anyway, it leads to her getting Bill Burr and Huel to go over, and I fucking love this scene. It's such a great scene. I mean, I love Huel. I think this is not only, I mentioned Bill Burr already, but I didn't mention Huel because I'm pretty sure this is the first season that introduces Huel as well. I think he appeared in the second episode of the season, if I remember correctly, but I think this is the first one that really establishes Huel. I fucking love Huel. I like this whole scene is absolutely amazing where they built Bill Burr and Huel go to Ted's house to try to force him to write the check and pay the IRS, and this whole interaction is amazing. Like, and Bill Burr is pretty good at acting, like the way he's like, so this is all about making Huel happy. And he's like, who's Huel? And it's like, he's Huel. And it's like, are you happy, Huel? And he's like, reasonably. it's just I fucking love Huel. It's just such an amazing scene. And then of course I love. It's just, again, it's interjecting comedy in here. I love how Ted like freaks out and starts running away, and he's just sitting there and looks at him, and Bill Burr also is just like, they don't even try to chase him, and he just trips over the rug. And also, again, you get the setups in this scene because in the previous scene where Skylar goes over to see Ted, I think it was this episode, they show that Ted kind of trips over that rug. That rug is kind of and again, this is the little subtle hints, the little subtle setups that they have in there. Because that will come into play when he tries to make a run for it, and he trips right over the rug and just collides and smashes his head. And the way Huel and Bill Burr just looking like, that wasn't cool. Like, oh my god, it's such a love that scene. But the whole storyline with Ted is a bit ridiculous because he's being a buffoon in this season. I mean, I don't think he was portrayed as a bit goofy maybe in the previous seasons, but not as an outright buffoon. That's just, I think he's, the way he's outright refusing to pay off the IRS, defies all logic. And you can say, oh, he's just an idiot, but again, it makes him too much of a buffoon, too much of an idiot, that he outright like is denying us. Oh, I don't think I'm going to go to prison. And Skylar's like, oh my god, how can I not explain this to you? And so it is a bit plot contrivance, like they need for him to be this dumb in order to create the plot to make him a problem. But so I think they do go a little bit overboard with it, which is why I'm not a huge fan of this storyline. But I still love that scene. Are you happy? Reasonably. Anyway, so yes, that is why Walt doesn't have the money. And so you get to me, which is, again, one of the most iconic scenes in that entire show, and again, of all television visual media in history. It's like, it brings chills down my spine every time I watch it. It's an absolutely amazing scene where Walt goes to get the money, and he's freaking out. It's like, where's the money? And Sky, because he thinks he needs it to save him and his family. Like, they need it for the disappearer. And Scarlett's like, oh, I gave it to Ted. And she's like, please listen to me. And just Walt loses his shit and starts like having that crazy mental breakdown and just laughs hysterically. And just the look on Skylar's face as he's freaking out, laughing and go inside this crawl space. And again, beautiful, amazing cinematography along with the music. And at the same time, like, Marie calls, she's all in the panic because, Walt had told Saul to tip off the DEA that someone was trying to kill Hank. So Marie calls right at the same time, freaking out that the cartel's coming to kill Hank and they're all in danger. And at the same time, where Skylar's listening to this frantic message from Marie, you still hear Walt laughing, like having his mental breakdown, laughing hysterically in the background. Like, it was just amazing television. It's like such an intense, amazing scene. It's just, it's fucking brilliant. And it does really set the stage. So that leads us to the next episode, End Times. And it begins And again, the way that begins the scene between Walt and Skyler was fucking amazing. Where Walt pretty much tells Skyler that he needs to die. Like he says that he needs that all the it's when it comes to his realize it's when he's like a human being, and this is something that he'll forget about. He'll let his pride and his arrogance get the better of him after he defeats Gus, and this is when he goes downhill in season 5, and he'll come back to this spot at the end of season 5 after he completely ruined his life again. So it's kind of like he should have learned his lesson here, because here he has the humility where because he's pretty much resolved to the fact that Gus is going to kill him. At this point, it's more of trying to stop Gus from killing his family. So, and the way that conversation he has with Skyler, like the goodbye, and she realizes that he's going to die, and she's trying to talk him out of it, because even though she knows it's logical, she just can't accept it. And I like that. I like that she still feels that way even after all their marital issues, even after she learns to despise him. The concept of coming face to face with his death is just too much for her, but eventually he talks her into it and gets her to stay with Hank and Marie and Walt Jr. Under DEA protection. But he refuses to go, and of course he can't tell them why he refuses to go, so he has to make up a bullshit excuse. But of course Hank, he thinks this whole thing is a sham to get him to stop investigating Gus, which is a pretty interesting conclusion, not exactly accurate. But he is not worried at all. He doesn't think there's any danger. He's like, I don't care if you come, whatever. But Marie, of course, is freaked out, and I love it in their conversation how Walt even mentioned, Marie tends to overact and she's overreacting, but Skyler points out, but she's not overreacting. That's true. She's actually, in this case, not. But how she freaks out and tries to convince Walt to come, but he still refuses. So we see him, and again, nice setup. We see him in his pool, sitting by the pool, trying to figure out what the fuck to do, that he's totally fucked. And you just see him divert his eyes and look over at a plant just sitting over there, which, again, the way they set up things, and really subtly, it really makes this show a masterpiece. So then we find out that Brock is poisoned. Now that's another thing I didn't talk of, because I think it was the previous episode, Crawl Space, where Walt goes to see Jesse. Again, I'm always talking about previous episodes. I always forget shit. But anyway, the previous episode where Walt goes to try to convince Jesse, but Jesse is still totally not on his side, and just like, get the fuck out of here. But sees him with Brock and Andrea, and this is that's another interesting story arc I haven't really touched on this season, is Andrea. I think overall, my thoughts on Andrea is that, because it was interesting, really earlier in the season when Jesse was still in his party phase, he didn't want Andrea involved in that, and actually didn't want her in drugs at all, and he was giving her money to make a better life for herself and her son. And then we see later in the season he's doing it through Saul, but then eventually apparently he comes around to involving himself in her life, and is staying with them, and is sort of helping to be a father to Brock and a lover to Andrea. Now, part of me thinks that they never really explored Jesse and Andrea's storyline enough. I talked about this in my season 3 review, that she comes off as kind of just the token love interest, and we don't really see why the relationship works like the way, for example, Jane was explored, in the relationship Jesse and Jane had was really strong and really well explored, one of the strengths of season 2. But in contrast, Andrea just seems like a follow-up, like a fling type thing. But in retrospect, I think that's probably might have been done on purpose. The show might actually be saying that Jesse doesn't have a strong connection with Andrea, and that really he's mainly staying with her and helping her out because of the way he feels about children, the way he wants to help Brock, the way he feels sorry for his cousin or half brother, whoever it was that killed Kambu, how he got killed and whatnot. And so it's more of a sympathy and wanting to help rather and wanting to sort of be a father figure. And he's always shown that ever since the season 2 episode Peekaboo, have shown that he's a caring man who cares for kids, maybe because of his own childhood, and actually wants to help kids. So I think his involvement with her has more to do with that, and he doesn't really love her as a human being or for who she really is. It's more of his desire and his need to be a family man. That's kind of what I get out of it. But anyway, all it's that to say is that we find out Brock is poisoned in this episode, and Jesse thinks it was the ricin, so his first thought is to kill Walt. Because his first thought is that surely Walt did it. And Walt is like, in the way he's like, again, we have another intense, like amazing, beautiful scene, masterclass, like top of the line, intense scene where Jesse goes over to kill Walt, and Walt's all freaked out about end times and like, Gus is gonna kill me, he's gonna kill my family, and then Jesse pulls a gun on him and accuses him of poisoning Brock, and the way Walt's like, I did not do this. Such an amazing scene. And then how he starts again, kind of the same kind of laughing to a lesser degree in the previous episode. He starts laughing and freaking out. Of course it's Gus who did it, because I've been waiting for Gus to kill an assassin, send an assassin to kill me all day, and I hadn't realized that he did. It's you're the assassin. And at first Jesse's in denial, but then he realizes that Gus is that heartless and that kind of a master class manipulator and chess player who sees 3 moves ahead, and Jesse's like, oh fuck, I'm gonna kill him. Now of course we do find out in the next episode it's actually Walt who's the master chess player, who's seeing 4 moves ahead. And I do love that, how when you watch this episode you actually believe that Walt is ignorant of Brock being poisoned, because the way he says I did not do this is completely convincing. And what the revelation in the next episode gives us, it does show just how much of a master manipulator he really is. And so he gets Jesse to go along with this plan to try to kill Gus, and they come up with the plan to try to lure Gus into the hospital by Jesse refusing to come and cook. And they're going to plant the bomb in his car, but Gus sniffs it out. He realizes that something's wrong, and he refuses to return to his car. Now I do think this does kind of make him a bit too much of a genius. I mean, really, how did he know that the bomb specifically would be in his car? I mean, even if he thought there was something odd about the way Jesse refused to return to work or whatnot, I don't know. I think it is making us like too much of a genius, but it's still made for an intense scene, seeing Walt on the rooftop. And the way, like, you see Gus start to get his suspicions, and he goes off to the rooftop and looks around. You could say maybe he did spot Walt in the distance, and so that's how he knew not to get out of the car, but I don't know. So regardless, his plan didn't work, but still, this is, again, mainly for that Walt and Jesse scene, which is, like, again, amazing. It's, again, a pure, and the whole, like, adrenaline of this episode that really kicked the Walt versus Gus storyline into overdrive, again, makes this an amazing, amazing episode. Anyway, we get to the finale, finally, Face Off, which a lot of people name as one of the best, if not the best episode of the show. I count myself amongst them. I think this is one of the best episodes of the show. It's the perfect conclusion for the storyline that really kicks it into overdrive, where so the police hold Jesse for because they suspect him of poisoning Brock, because he mentioned specifically the ricin. But really, and Saul kind of points this out to them, that Jesse being held by the police is kind of a good thing, because it makes it so Gus can't get to him. As we see, as soon as the police do release him, Gus nabs him and forces him to cook. So this is when he kind of does that thing where he's holding Jesse hostage and forcing him to cook. But I think Gus did reason out that Jesse was involved with Walt in his attempt to try to kill him. So you can kind of see his reaction there. But Walt kind of tries to come up with another plan to kill Gus, and Jesse, through Saul, brings up the whole thing about Hector and how he visits him. And I love, again, this is an amazing scene where Walt comes to the realization. He's like, wait a second, they're not old friends, they're enemies. And because he realizes that an old friend he can do nothing with, but an enemy, he can work with him to take Gus down. And it's just, again, such an intense scene when Walt shows up at the nursing home to see Hector. And this actor is fucking amazing. Like, the range of emotions he can show for just a few, like, facial expressions and, like, heavy breathing, like, is it's just fucking amazing. But anyway, Walt shows up and is like, look, I know you want me dead. I know you despise me, but I am thinking there's someone you despise even more. And I can help you get revenge on that person. And then we see his whole plan play out. And again, he had epic scenes, the way they were shot, of Gus arriving at the funeral home to see if Walt's plan, which we don't know at this stage what it is. Also, I got to talk about the whole way they laureled. And again, this is when you get a bit of a comedy. Again, they try to always inject a bit of comedy in the show. Because Hector asks to speak to the, he writes need DEA, but the nurse doesn't understand. It's like, what is DIA? DIA is not a word. It's just funny. But anyway, he lures Gus out by meeting with the DA and specifically having Hank there, so that he knows that Gus will have a man watching Hank, so he knows that they'll see Hank go into a meeting with him. So, of course, he's going to conclude that he's ratting Gus out to the DEA, but he stays true to his nature of never working with law enforcement, and instead says suck my, and then they're like, alright, let's stop it again. Alright, can you stop messing around? And then he says fuck you. That's a funny scene. So basically the whole point was just to be in that room with Hank. Like, once he's there, it doesn't matter what the fuck he can say, so he's just like, suck my dick and fuck off, or whatever he was going to say, because he doesn't care, because his goal had already been accomplished at this stage, was just to make Gus think that he was ratting out the DA. And also, I love the scene leading up to that with Marie in the safe house. It's kind of classic comedy, the way, because the DA called Hank to go to this meeting with Hector, and Hank really wants to go, but Marie's like, no, you're not going. She's like, you're staying here, you're not going, and that's final. And they immediately cut to the meeting where Hank is there, and the guy's like, thanks for coming in, Hank. It's great comedy. But anyway, that all leads up to Gus going to kill Hector. And it is a gamble, because what if, the plan could have failed horribly, like, because Gus could have sent a goon to kill Hector and not kill him himself. Now, they were betting on Gus because of his strong desired need for revenge and the strong hatred he has for Hector for killing his lover. They were banking on Gus doing it himself. And they turned out to be right, and to be fair, it was a good guess. I mean, that was really strong indications that Gus wouldn't simply send one of his goons. But it's not a certainty. Like, they certainly could have been wrong. And in fact, when the goon showed up, I think both, and that's what made the scene so intense, is that both Hector and Walt were worried that the goon was just going to kill Hector then and there, and then their plan would be fucked. I mean, sure, Hector could kill the goon, but that's not the point. The point is to kill Gus. But, the goon was just there to check out the room, and so then once they cleared everything, I think that's why Walt was hiding in shadow, because it was before he planned the bomb, because he wanted to, I guess they knew they would have a goon check out the room before they actually brought Gus in. So after the goon left, he planted the bomb and then left because he didn't want to be anywhere around there, didn't want to ruin the plan. And so Gus comes in to kill Hector and does the whole thing. Now, the way Gus had been taunting Hector, especially after he killed all the cartel members and explained to them, and he said, "I killed your grandson," and all that. And it was super intense. Now Hector refused to look at Gus. And even at this point where Hector's lecturing Gus about, "You're a dirty rat and you're going to die a dirty rat," and Hector still refuses to look at him until he looks him straight in the eye and gives this look of pure rage. And again, the actor does, it should be commended to no end, to convey that much rage and hatred in one look. And as he starts pounding the bell, and then Gus starts to realize, he looks around and sees the bomb and realizes his plan and screams and tries to get out, but it's too late. And they blow him up. Masterpiece. It's just masterpiece. It's a storytelling at its absolute best. They really, really knew how to build tension. And now it is a bit silly how Gus walks out and they try to fake you out to make it think he's still alive, because they show the one side of his face where he looks fine, but the others, then they go forward and the other side's like a skeleton, and he falls to the floor dead. That's obvious there just to fake you out, and it's really unrealistic. That's not how explosions affect people. That's not realistic. And a lot of people are also pointing out it's supposed to visually mirror that whole teddy bear from season 2, but I hate that teddy bear, so I don't care about that. But it's a symbol for Walt's guilt or whatever. Just fuck off with that. But anyway, but goddamn, it was still such an amazing scene. It was just, and it's so great. It's just. And Walt did manage to outwit Gus. He managed to kill Gus. And he found the weakness and exploited it. And his weakness, of course, was the intense hatred and revenge he needed to have on Hector. And in the end, Hector got his revenge on Gus. After Gus came and of course, Hector didn't know Gus was the reason why he's in the chair, but he knows that Gus just killed all of his family and his cartel family as well. His whole life, everything he's ever known, everyone he's ever loved, Gus killed him. And so he actually got his revenge on Gus. It's just such a powerful scene overall. And then you have the call with Skylar where she's freaked out and she's like, "What are they saying on the news?" And Walt's like, "We're not in danger anymore, don't worry, I took care of it." But she wants to know, it's that bombing where Gus Fring was killed, was that you? And his response, "I won." And of course we'll be feeling the repercussions of that throughout season 5, which we damn well should. But again, this is where Walt sort of let his arrogance and his pride get the better of him, because now he's so cocky because he actually managed to defeat Gus. And then, of course, you get the slow pan in by Walt's pull that pans into that plant that we saw him looking at in the previous episode, and it reveals the tag. And I gotta admit, I didn't catch this the first time I saw this episode, because it just casually mentioned that Brock wasn't actually poisoned by ricin. He was poisoned by a berry from something called the flower of the lily or whatever, or lily of the valley or whatever it was. So it's just a passing line, which I didn't remember when I first saw this episode, but the second time, definitely caught it, where they do a slow pan on the plant and they have the tag that says what it is, and it says Lily of the Valley. But I did get that Walt had poisoned Brock. I did get that was the reason why they were doing a slow pan on the plant. I just didn't remember that it was called Lily of the Valley, but I did get that was the implication. that Walt was the one who poisoned Brock. So again, he was the master chess player manipulator. He manipulated Jesse into helping him because he knew Jesse was the key, and he knew Jesse hated him, and he knew Jesse couldn't be reasoned with, so he knew. And that was a huge risk. Again, that could have blew up in his face, but again, it was kind of at the stage where he had nothing to lose. Like, Jesse's first thought was that it was Walt who poisoned Brock, and he knew that would be his first thought. So he was putting himself directly in danger and banking on the fact that he would be able to convince Jesse that Gus was the one to do it. But he could have well been wrong, and Jesse could have killed him right then and there. So it was a gambit. But it happened to work. It paid off. And again, we will be seeing the repercussions of that as well. And that's what makes this show so great, is that it's strong, ironclad strong, like extremely strong sense of continuity. That everything that happens, even like minor things, minor details in the background, they all have consequence. And they're all remembered. I mean, there are a few slight retcons throughout the show, sure. Like the whole teddy bear thing was very mishandled. But overall, it does the best job of any show I've ever seen of maintaining that strong sense of every action you make has consequences. And it's just amazing. It's just perfectly amazing. So, that's it. That's the episodes of Season 4 of Breaking Bad. So now, as tradition, I'll get into my least favorite and my favorite episode of the season. As for least favorite, as I said, there's no bad episodes this season, but there were a lot of sort of slower, dragging episodes. Particularly in the first half of the season, you had Open House, Bullet Points, and Cornered. But for me, the worst episode has to go to Shotgun, which again is not a terrible episode, but it was really boring. It did drag too much about, Mike taking Jesse out on these, hunts while Walt overreacts and thinks that Gus is going to kill him. I mean, it's more and more of the same of what we got. And I actually thought, the opening scene of, Walt freaking out and driving all fast to pull us a mile. So it's kind of a letdown. Like, they're acting like it's super intense and things are going to get ahead, but then it ends up nothing happens and Mike just sits in the car with Jesse and they talk about pimento sandwiches. By the way, another nice Easter egg that Better Call Saul picked up on the whole pimento sandwich thing. I had no idea that was first mentioned here. Anyway, as for best episode, I mean, what can I say? Lot of amazing, great episodes. So hard to choose from. I mean, you got Box Cutter, you got Bug, you got Hermanos, but of course, the cream of the crop, it was one amazing episode after another. You got Salute, Crawl Space, End Times, and Face Off. Now, as for out of those four, which were all amazing masterpieces in their own right, which one do I think is the best? Part of me really, really wants to go with Salud. Again, that the whole way the episode is titled, the salute is what he says when they cheer before they drink the drink that poisons them all. Because it is an amazing episode. But in the end, I do have to go with Face Off. I do have to say Face Off is the best episode of the season. It is an absolute masterpiece, an amazing episode. The final battle of wits between Walt and Gus, which ends spectacular. It's just the whole way it was built up to is just pure beauty. Storytelling at its best. No doubt. So my rating for Breaking Bad Season 4 out of 10. God, this is a hard one. This is a really tough one. I think I'm going to have to go with a 9. Now, if I did decimal points, this would be like a 9.5. Or something like that. It's a strong 9. A really, really, really strong. Maybe like a 9.8 or something. Very close to being a 10. Very close. But I feel like I need to just hold it back slightly because of the first half of the season was not very interesting and moved way too slow. And it was kind of a bit of a drudge to get through. And at first you think, well, the season's not that good because it's just retreading and the same, Jesse's ashamed of murdering Gale, and Walt's freaked out about Gus killing him. They kind of just retread that over and over again. But again, ultimately, it managed to be great setup, because that second half, though, of the season is just pure fucking gold. Like, everything about it is some of the best storytelling ever seen. So that's why this season comes so close to getting a 10. But ultimately, I am going to have to go with a 9. Excellent season. Anyway, that is it for my review of Season 4 of Breaking Bad. Thank you so much for watching this video. I shall be back in a month to cover the final season, Season 5 of Breaking Bad, which I will cover all in one video, even though it was aired in 2 halves. Like, there was a huge break in between the first half and the second half. And it's an extended season, so it's probably going to be a super long video. And I'm probably also going to cover the movie El Camino in that video as well, so it's going to be a really long video. But oh well, that's what I decided. I'm not going to try to break it up into halves. Do it all in one go. So finish off my coverage next month with Season 5 of Breaking Bad. Anyway, be sure to check out my channel as I cover many other shows like Star Trek, Discovery, The Expanse, The Outer Limits, and more. So be sure to subscribe so you can keep up with all of that. And thanks a lot for watching.